All right, welcome back to LIS 570. This week we're going to talk all about data collection methods in qualitative research. We're going to hit just a couple of the key methods that I think show the diversity of the way that we can inductively generate data to test hypotheses and to generate theory that may be of a middle or applied range. But what I think is important about this week in terms of where we sit in the quarter is that we're starting to learn how the research questions that we've asked might get operationalized and answered through some systematic, rigorous methods. So let's jump in and look at what qualitative methods are really all about at the data collection phase. All right, so the agenda for our lecture is going to look like this. I'm going to talk a little bit about how data collection through qualitative research methods hits this logic of induction. And then we'll talk about three of probably the most broadly used or broadly conceived methods in qualitative scholarship that has to do with the interview, documenting content analysis, as well as participant observation. And then we're going to conclude by talking about how we might use these methods in combination with one another to achieve what is triangulation. All right, so let's jump in and think about the way in which our data collection then matches our logic sitting behind the research that we've designed. So as we talked about in the introductory lecture to qualitative and quantitative methods, we typically think of research moving from the general to the specific or from the specific to the general. Now, it's worth thinking about the way that qualitative methods interact with or construct with the two paradigms that we've described so far. That is positivist and interpretivist or constructivist, right? So constructivists would see the world as socially constructed, and as such, they're going to move from a particular set of observations towards an explanatory, descriptive theory. So that requires the qualitative researcher that's going to work in this kind of tradition to think about being open and sensitive to the way that different populations may be interpreted, right? Because this is going to sit at kind of the heart or the set of assumptions that we have working inductively. The qualitative researcher also is going to seek to make meaning out of these observations such that we may use one method of data collection or we may use a couple in order to have a big enough set of data that we can infer some patterns and that we can develop some hypotheses. So typically we do this in search or in service of trying to get towards some explanation, which helps us make sense of that particular population. But I think it's important, or why I reinforce it here, is that the induction really lines up with the way that we think about paradigms of constructive research and qualitative methods more generally. So the three methods that we're going to talk about are going to be the interview, documenting content analysis, as well as participant observation. So for each of these three methods, what I'm going to try to do is give kind of a general overarching explanation and talk about what are some of the maybe contextual values, the way that we go about sampling from populations using this method, the way that we develop instruments to collect data, then the data that gets generated by using these instruments, and finally, a little bit about what the sensitivities of the data that we're collecting using these methods might have or might imply. The first research method that we're going to talk about is the participant interview, which is probably the most recognizable of all of the qualitative methods. But I think it's important to contrast this with what might be popular notions, either in the media or kind of the assumptions that we bring to what the interview looks like and what it's ultimately trying to achieve in a social science qualitative sense. So unlike, say, journalistic or criminal investigations in which there's an informant or there's a source and a set of maybe police officers or a journalist are going to and trying to extract information and be informed by that source, a qualitative researcher has a much more neutral stance in the sense that what they're trying to do in interacting with and engaging a participant one-on-one is trying to make some meaning. Right? If we step back and think about the way that a constructivist sees the world, they see the world as socially constructed. And so if that social construction means that that tells us something about reality, or it tells us something about the subject or topic that we're working on, then we need to construct socially with our participants some understanding of the way that their experiences have informed or should inform our understanding of a particular topic. Let's think about this in a particular example. So imagine that I was interested in digital literacy, and I was particularly interested in undergraduate, maybe freshmen. One thing that I could do would be to recruit a set of undergraduate freshmen to talk to me about their experiences learning, using, and interacting with different forms of digital media. Right? This would tell me, or this would allow me to understand the way that they approach these topics, what their lived histories are, what exactly they think and they feel about maybe certain types of instruction around digital literacy, maybe particular interventions that were really formative and helpful, or maybe particular interventions that were really harmful. But the point is that I have direct access to the participants, and I have a way in which I can maybe directly follow up questions, which help me gain significant understanding of that particular person and that particular point in time in which they've had experiences. Now, obviously, in order to be able to move from a particular set of observations to a hypothesis, we're going to have multiple people that we interview. And so what the interview is trying to do then from a sampling standpoint is get a hold on what might be meaningful in terms of a representative subpopulation for us to go and talk to. But it's pretty labor intensive to both recruit, that is find people to participate in our study, but also to interview, because we have to know something about those people going in. We have to take some time to both emotionally and probably physically, if we're going and doing interviews in person, travel from place to place. So when we think about sort of the range or the amount of interviews that we do for a qualitative study that's using the interview method, typically we're thinking anywhere from 10 to, if it were a really large project, something like 50 or even 100. Oftentimes really large projects like that have whole teams of people that go out and do interviews. When we think of the overarching value to taking an interview methodological approach versus any other methodological approach in the qualitative tradition, it's really about our direct ability to interact with the participants. We can ask questions. We can ask for clarifications. We can ask someone to maybe elaborate on why it is that they think or feel the way that they do. And so this sort of self-reporting comes with a certain amount of bias because it's shaped by that person's feeling and ideas. But if we're constructivists or if we're qualitative researchers that are leaning into that bias, we don't necessarily see a problem with that. What we want to do is have from our sample a relative certainty about the way that we can make meaning across all of our interviews. And so one of the steps that we use to make meaning across our interviews is to try to structure them in a way that we're asking similar questions of our participants in each interview. That way we can analyze the results based on different people answering the same questions. But one of the other ways that we're structuring our instrument is to have flexibility so that we can interject our own maybe feelings and interpretations to share with our participants, or that we can flexibly go in maybe one direction or another. So we can think of there being an instrument, which is a set of questions that we'll ask each of our participants, but there may be a branching logic. That is, there may be a specific line of questions that we ask one set of participants and a particular line of questions that we maybe ask another set of participants. And we may make that decision in the moment of doing our interview, or we may make it in advance given some demographic characteristic of our participant. Now, the data that we yield or that we get from an interview is oftentimes an audio recording of the interview as it takes place. So that audio recording is then turned into a textual transcript, and that textual transcript, and we'll look at a couple of these next week, is what we ultimately end up analyzing. We compare what one person said versus another. And when we write our research reports, which we'll talk about in even more weeks, what we're going to do is use that as evidence. We're going to justify our beliefs based on what people said and the context in which they said it. Now, the sensitivities of managing this kind of data are obviously really high. We have participants that have personally identifiable information that they're willing to share with us in order to to engage with our research, but we also have information about their lives. We have information about their experiences. Some of those experiences will be maybe highly contentious, will be maybe things they don't want the whole world to know, but they were comfortable in a particular situation sharing with us. So just like we talked about consent being something that was negotiated over time, it cannot be overstated about the sensitivities of interview data that we interject and we remind our participants that we're doing research, and that as we manage the data, that is the transcripts and the audio, we're careful to not allow that to be in shareable locations or discoverable locations, such as maybe in our email, which our roommates or our partners or someone else may have access to, right? We keep our data local, and we keep our data typically anonymized by having a participant code or some participant identifier, which is not a person's direct name or a person's direct identity. Now, this participant identifier is something that we can use across all of our research methods. It's not necessarily particular to interviews, but it's something that we can pick up and we can use across participant observation as well. All right, so let's jump into what is our next method, which is going to be document and content analysis. Now, if interviews are all about people and the biases they may contain, the ideas that they may have, and the subjectivity that we create and we construct and make sense of through our interactions, document and content analysis is going to work somewhat parallel to that by focusing on artifacts. And by artifacts here, we mean maybe text, we mean maybe web pages, we mean maybe audio or even video that we can treat as similar to the transcript of a qualitative interview, a source for our analysis. And we do this by being intentional in gathering documents or gathering things like media that have content about them that we can build some understanding of our research question or our research concept. Typically, there's two ways in which document or content analysis is carried out. One is to focus on concepts which are internal to any one particular document or media with content. So concepts that we might pull out are, for example, if I were to look at every presidential page, web page, I might be analyzing it to look at the way that they talk about asylum or the way that they talk about immigration. I could also do something which was much more systematic and look at the way that they use particular web structures in order to create accessible web pages. But the point here is that internally we can analyze content in a particular document, or we can compare, that is, relationships between different documents. And this relationship building that we do is going to require us to pattern make across a bunch of different documents or a bunch of different media with content that we've gathered. So the overarching value of doing document or content analysis is oftentimes in including this as a supplement to maybe an interview or maybe a participant observation. Because what this is going to give us is a pretty low bias data source. That is, text can't really lie, right? Well, they can contain lies, but they don't change over time, and they're not necessarily inconsistent in the way that we extract meaning from them. It's also very convenient to access, say, web documents or access artifacts. We don't have to set schedules. We don't have to meet up. We don't have to go through all of the negotiation of making meaning with a particular person, right? We just have that direct access to the object. Okay, so sampling in document and content analysis requires us to construct what we call a corpus. A corpus is going to be all of the documents or all of the media, all of the objects that we have that we want to assemble for analysis. Now, in order to construct our corpus, we're going to have to justify why it is certain documents or media belong in the corpus and certain media or content don't. That is, we're going to, just like we do people, sample. And we're going to sample based on maybe if we're looking at presidential web pages, who are the major candidates that are on ballots in maybe 50 or maybe 40 of the 50 states. Right, so we'll have some criteria which will tell us why we should collect certain types of documents. And we'll make some justification around why those are the right documents for our corpus. Now, the instrument that we use to ultimately make sense of our corpus then is going to be what we call a codebook. So the codebook is going to formally define some concepts or some relationships and how it is we'll perform analysis for those concepts or those relationships. So we may just count the number of times a concept like immigration appears on a presidential webpage, or we may compare how does Biden versus Trump versus Kanye West describe immigration on their sites. So the corpus, the codebook, and then ultimately our application of that codebook. So how we make annotations or how we extract information from our documents and content are going to be what makes up the data for our document and content analysis studies. Now, the sensitivities of documents and content analysis research are going to be the sensitivities of the documents. If we obtain documents directly from individuals, maybe that are participants in a set of interviews or a set of participant observations, then there's going to be some sensitivity that we need to manage like anything else. We need to anonymize or we need to create a set of participant identifiers. But if we're just collecting things, say, from the web, or we're maybe using documents that are in a public domain, there's probably going to be low sensitivity. So there's probably little that we have to do in terms of anonymization. And we'll talk about this as we go forward into the weeks in the future. The documents in our corpus that contain information about people are still human subject research, right? And so we need to still operate with the same kind of ethical sensitivities that we would use for any other type of study. Right, so finally, let's turn our attention to the last method that we'll talk about for qualitative research, which is participant observation. This is very much akin to what we traditionally call ethnography, or in anthropology, we think of as observational cultural studies. Now, in a participant observation, essentially what the researcher is doing is turning themselves into an instrument for data collection. And what this means is that the powers of observation, that is putting oneself in particular cultures, at particular places, and in particular times, will be the kind of necessary steps in order to record and to interpret the world that's happening around a researcher and around research subjects. Now, a participant observation is highly coupled or often coupled with interviews and with document and content analysis. That is, the method of participant observation requires that we sort of triangulate in ways that are really central to the meaning-making process of observing and reporting on our observations. Because the thing that we maybe avoid in taking steps away from treating our participants as the primary source of data is that we introduce our own bias. And even if we are, say, constructivist of the deepest commitments, we still have to grapple with and try to determine the way in which we achieve some subjectivity in the reporting and the interpretation that we do. So the value to doing participant observation, that is recording our sort of engagement and our meaning making through powers of observation in the natural world, is that this is something that becomes a rich narrative in which we can explain why certain events or certain artifacts come into being through a process. So that is, participant observation is quite good at explaining procedural elements that are maybe capitalized in some action or maybe described in some participant interview. Now, sampling for participant observation requires that we do similar things to, say, our interviews or our document analysis. That is, we're purposeful and we're systematic. But the unit of analysis, that is, what we're attempting to observe and ultimately describe, is often a site as opposed to a particular person. And by this I mean, think of a unit of analysis here being maybe the site in which we will observe some action. So this could be a branch library. It could be a computer lab at a university. And we could abstract, or we could move up from maybe that unit of observation to, say, all of the branches in a library system, or all of the computer labs or spaces in which computing resources are accessed by students at a university. The point here is that the site is the kind of key element to thinking of sampling within participant observation. Now, the instruments of participant observation are, as we kind of said, the researcher themselves. But this doesn't mean we kind of approach this haphazardly in terms of recording and documenting the observations that we make. Quite the opposite. There are very formal methods for recording 3 types of documents or 3 types of products that ultimately become our data for a participant observation. So the first is a field note. That field note will be really the kind of observations and notes, the natural kind of way in which we observe the world and record our ideas about it. The field note gets transformed at a later time after one leaves a field site into what's called an analytic memo. Now, the analytic memo tries to make sense of the observation time or the observation period that we just engaged in. So this means oftentimes we try to explain to ourselves first, what did I just see? What were the things that people were just doing in that computer lab, and what does that tell me about ultimately answering my research question? That is, we're moving from the observation to the pattern making in inductive research through the power of explaining in the memo. Now, after the memo, what comes next is that we're going to start to try to formalize those into some hypotheses, right? We're going to try to explain some of what we've been observing, either based on other evidence that we have, maybe we've conducted some interviews, or based purely on the observations that we have. The sensitivities that arise from doing participant observation are obviously of the highest order, right? We have participants, we have places, and we have maybe in scenarios in which they're engaging with one another, or we're watching procedures unfold. So when we record information about people, and when we take things out of the field, such as images or sound recordings, one of the things we have to be highly sensitive to do is to manage those in ways that protect the personally identifiable information of our participants, but also in that we are the instrument of interpretation, take steps to protect ourselves. So in that we have a sort of identity in the data that we'll be ultimately depositing or sharing about our research, we have to take some steps to obscure some of our identity or inject our identity and deal with the repercussions. It's sort of a step that's preferential based on the particular researcher. And we'll talk more about this as we move on to the analysis stage of qualitative methods. To sum up though, I want to say one real quick thing about triangulation. Using multiple methods of collecting, analyzing, and interpreting qualitative data is, in my opinion, oftentimes strengthened by our ability to draw on different traditions, such as the interview or the document and content analysis traditions. By doing so, we can think of our triangulation as a method which is going to ensure internal validity of our work. That is, we have the ability to design rigorously and use different pieces of data to get at maybe the same question or to get at slightly different nuanced interpretations of a question. And I think that when we seek to be representative in qualitative research, triangulation is kind of one of the strongest things we can do in an inductive logic. So we'll talk more about how we can achieve and how we can synthesize, bring some data together by using multiple methods next week when we talk about qualitative data analysis. But for now, I think it's important to have in the back of our head the way that we might use one method independently, or we may use methods in conjunction with one another.